Imagine for a moment that you're living your life as usual, waking up every day, going to work, spending time with your family without thinking too much about what happens after death. When suddenly, in a split second, everything changes completely. You find yourself face to face with something you never imagined could exist, something so terrifying, so real, so visceral, that it shakes every fiber of your being and forever changes the way you see life, death, and everything in between. Those two crucial moments of human existence. This is the extraordinary story of a man who had experienced exactly that, a moment that shattered everything he believed in, destroyed his deepest convictions, and led him down a path he never thought he would walk, a path that took him straight into the arms of the Catholic Church. You're about to witness one of the most astonishing religious conversion stories ever, documented journey that goes far beyond a simple change in belief. This is a complete transformation of soul, mind, and heart. And it all began in the most unlikely place imaginable, the depths of hell. This man wasn't religious. He didn't go to church. He had no interest in spiritual matters or theological debates. He was just an ordinary person, like millions of others around the world, living a secular life, focused on daily responsibilities, chasing personal and professional goals, never once imagining that the supernatural might have any relevance to his practical, everyday existence. But what happened to him was so powerful, so life-altering, so impossible to ignore, that it not only changed his own life, it has impacted thousands of people around the world, who've heard his testimony and felt compelled to reconsider their own beliefs about life after death. If you're enjoying this content and want to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. We publish each week. The experience this man lived through wasn't just a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't the product of imagination or some altered state of consciousness caused by medication or substances. It was something he describes as more real than anything he's ever experienced in this earthly life, more vivid than his sharpest memories, more impactful than any event he had ever witnessed across decades of existence. He saw with his own eyes the eternal flames. He felt the unbearable heat. He heard the screams of despair. He witnessed the indescribable suffering of souls who had chosen to separate themselves from God for all eternity. And more than that, he understood with crystal clarity that the same fate awaited him unless he completely changed the direction of his life. But this isn't just a story about fear, terror, or warnings from the beyond. At its core, it's a story about hope, about divine mercy, about the infinite goodness of a God who doesn't want a single soul to be lost. A God who reaches out even to those who have spent their entire lives far from him. A God who offers redemption, even when everything seems lost and without solution. This man's journey from hell to the Catholic Church is a powerful demonstration of how God can use the most extreme and terrifying experiences to awaken hardened hearts, break down walls of unbelief, and guide lost souls back to the path of salvation. You'll be amazed to discover the specific details of what he saw, the revelations he received about the fate of souls, the deep truths about the spiritual reality that governs our universe, and most of all, how those revelations led him not just to believe in God, but to embrace the Catholic faith in all its doctrinal richness, its sacraments, its ancient tradition, and its unique understanding of salvation and eternal life. This conversion didn't happen overnight. It wasn't simple or easy. It involved a deep journey of questioning, study, searching for truth, confronting inner resistance and prejudice, and ultimately, a total surrender to what he had experienced and come to understand as the absolute truth about spiritual reality. If this introduction has already sparked your curiosity, and you want to uncover every detail of this extraordinary story, leave a like on this video so we can keep bringing you more content like this, stories that reach deep into the human heart and reveal the most mysterious dimensions of existence. Meet Michael Thompson, a name that might sound completely ordinary to you. And indeed, everything about Michael's life was remarkably ordinary until the day that changed everything forever. A day that would transform him from a skeptical, secular man into one of the most compelling Catholic converts of our time. But let's start from the beginning, from the foundation of who Michael was before his extraordinary encounter with the supernatural realm that would shake his very core and redirect the entire trajectory of his existence. Michael was born in 1975 in a small suburban town in Ohio, raised by parents who were nominally Christian but rarely attended church. Parents who believed in being good people but didn't see much relevance in organized religion or deep spiritual practices, and this casual approach to faith, or lack thereof, would shape Michael's worldview for the first 43 years of his life. Growing up, Michael was the type of child who asked lots of questions, who challenged authority, who wanted logical explanations for everything. And when Sunday school teachers couldn't provide satisfactory answers to his inquiries about God, suffering, and the meaning of life, young Michael began to drift away from anything remotely spiritual, finding solace instead in science, logic, and rational thinking. His teenage years were marked by academic excellence, particularly in mathematics and engineering, subjects that offered concrete answers, predictable outcomes, and logical progressions that made sense to his analytical mind, unlike the mysteries and paradoxes of religious faith that seemed to require blind belief rather than intellectual understanding. By the time Michael reached college, he had fully embraced what he considered to be an enlightened, secular worldview, one that relied on empirical evidence, scientific methodology, and rational skepticism as the primary tools for understanding reality, and he looked down somewhat condescendingly on those who still clung to what he saw as outdated superstitions and primitive beliefs about gods, angels, demons, and afterlife scenarios. Michael earned his engineering degree with honors, launched a successful career in software development, married his college sweetheart Sarah, a woman who shared his secular outlook and pragmatic approach to life, and together they built what appeared to be the perfect modern American life, complete with a beautiful house in the suburbs, 2 cars in the driveway, annual vacations to exotic destinations, and a comfortable middle-class lifestyle that seemed to prove that happiness and fulfillment were entirely achievable without any need for religious faith or spiritual practices. For 20 years, Michael lived this way, confident in his choices, proud of his rational worldview, successful in his career, and content with his marriage, occasionally encountering religious people in his workplace or social circles, but always politely deflecting their attempts to discuss faith, viewing their beliefs as harmless but ultimately meaningless personal preferences that had no bearing on objective reality or practical life decisions. He was the type of person who would say things like, "I'm happy for you if religion gives you comfort, but I just don't need that kind of crutch in my life," or "I believe in being a good person, and I don't need ancient books or religious rules to tell me how to treat others with dignity and respect," statements that revealed both his fundamental decency as a human being and his complete disconnect from any sense of the transcendent or divine. Michael's daily routine was predictable and satisfying, waking up each morning at 6:30, drinking his coffee while reading the news on his tablet, commuting to his office, where he spent his days solving complex technical problems, coming home to dinner with Sarah, watching television or reading, and going to bed with the comfortable assurance that he understood how the world worked, and that his materialistic, rationalistic approach to life was not only correct but superior to the confused thinking of religious believers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the background of this incredible conversion story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our weekly uploads that explore the most fascinating spiritual transformations of our time. What makes Michael's story so particularly compelling is not just the dramatic nature of his eventual conversion, but the fact that he represents millions of educated, successful, secular individuals in modern society who have built their entire identity around the rejection of religious faith, people who pride themselves on their rational thinking and scientific worldview, people who would consider themselves the last candidates for any kind of spiritual awakening or religious conversion experience. Michael had developed what psychologists call a closed epistemic system, meaning that his beliefs about reality were so firmly established and internally consistent that he had essentially made himself immune to new information that might challenge his fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and the possibility of supernatural realities. This intellectual armor that Michael had constructed around himself made him feel secure and superior, but it also made him completely unprepared for what was about to happen to him, unprepared for an experience so powerful and undeniable that it would shatter his entire worldview in a matter of moments and leave him desperately searching for answers that his secular education had never provided. The irony, which Michael himself would later acknowledge, was that his very intelligence and analytical skills, the same qualities that had initially led him away from religious faith, would eventually become the tools he would use to carefully examine and ultimately embrace the Catholic faith with the same rigor and thoroughness that he had once applied to his engineering projects and software development challenges. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because in 2018, Michael Thompson was still living his comfortable, secular life, still confident in his materialistic worldview, still completely convinced that death was simply the end of consciousness, and that all talk of souls, afterlife, heaven, and hell was nothing more than primitive, wishful thinking designed to help people cope with the harsh realities of mortality and meaninglessness. He had no idea that within a few short months, everything he thought he knew about reality would be turned completely upside down, and that he would find himself on a spiritual journey that would lead him not just to belief in God, but to the ancient Catholic Church that he had once dismissed as an outdated institution filled with superstitious rituals and archaic doctrines that had no relevance to modern, educated people like himself. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2018, a day that started like any other in Michael Thompson's carefully structured life, with his usual alarm at 6:30, his customary cup of coffee, and his routine scroll through the morning news on his tablet. But by the end of that day, everything Michael thought he knew about reality would be shattered into a million pieces, and his comfortable, secular existence would be transformed into something he could never have imagined in his wildest dreams or most terrifying nightmares. Michael had been working long hours on a particularly challenging software project for his company, staying late at the office, skipping meals, and surviving on nothing but coffee and determination, a lifestyle that his doctor had warned him about during his last physical examination. But like many driven professionals, Michael had dismissed these concerns as overblown medical caution, confident that his 43-year-old body could handle whatever stress he threw at it. The morning began with Michael feeling unusually tired and experiencing what he initially dismissed as simple heartburn, probably caused by too much coffee and too little sleep. But as the day progressed, the discomfort in his chest began to intensify, spreading down his left arm and up into his jaw, symptoms that his rational mind tried to explain away as muscle strain from hunching over his computer for too many hours. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while Michael was in the middle of debugging a particularly complex piece of code, the pain suddenly became excruciating, like a vice tightening around his chest with crushing force, and he found himself struggling to breathe, his vision beginning to blur, his hands trembling as he tried to reach for his phone to call for help. His colleague Janet, who sat in the cubicle next to his, noticed Michael's distress and immediately called 911. But by the time the paramedics arrived, Michael had collapsed on the floor of his office, his face pale and his breathing shallow, his body going into cardiac arrest as his colleagues watched in horror and disbelief. The paramedics worked frantically to revive him, using defibrillation paddles to shock his heart back into rhythm. But for several critical minutes, Michael Thompson was clinically dead, his brain deprived of oxygen, his consciousness separated from his physical body in a way that his materialistic worldview had always insisted was impossible. What happened next would change not only Michael's life, but would challenge everything that modern medicine and scientific materialism claim to understand about consciousness, death, and the nature of human existence. According to Michael's later testimony, during those minutes when his body lay lifeless on the office floor, his consciousness remained fully intact, more alert and aware than he had ever been in his entire life. But he found himself in a place that defied every assumption he had ever held about reality, a place of absolute darkness and unimaginable terror that he would later identify as hell itself. Michael describes the experience as being more real than any dream he had ever had, more vivid than his most powerful memories, more intense than any physical sensation he had ever experienced in his 43 years of life, and what he encountered there would haunt him for months and ultimately drive him to seek answers that his secular education had never provided. The transition from his normal consciousness to this otherworldly realm was instantaneous and jarring, like stepping from a brightly lit room into complete darkness, except that this darkness was not merely the absence of light, but seemed to be a living, breathing entity that pressed against him from all sides, suffocating him with its malevolent presence and filling him with a terror so profound that it penetrated every fiber of his being. Michael found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast, desolate landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions, a place where the very air seemed to be made of despair, and the ground beneath his feet felt like it was composed of the accumulated suffering of countless souls who had found themselves trapped in this nightmare realm for eternity. The temperature was unbearably hot, not like the dry heat of a desert, but like the oppressive, humid heat of a furnace, and the atmosphere was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of sulfur that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water uncontrollably. But it was not the physical discomfort that affected Michael most profoundly. It was the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that permeated everything in this place, a despair so complete and absolute that it seemed to seep into his very soul and convince him that nothing good had ever existed or ever would exist again. If this incredible account is captivating your attention and you want to hear more extraordinary stories like this one, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up to help us reach more people who need to hear these powerful testimonies. Michael could hear sounds in the distance, sounds that he initially could not identify, but that filled him with dread. Sounds that seemed to combine the worst aspects of human suffering with something far more sinister and otherworldly. Sounds that spoke of torment that went beyond anything that could be inflicted on a physical body and reached into the deepest recesses of the human spirit. As he stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion, trying to make sense of what was happening to him, Michael began to notice that he was not alone in this place, that there were other figures moving through the darkness, figures that appeared to be human but were somehow distorted and broken, as if they had been subjected to suffering so intense that it had fundamentally altered their very essence. These figures moved with the mechanical, purposeless motion of beings who had lost all hope, all joy, all connection to anything that might have once given their existence meaning. And as Michael watched them, he began to understand with growing horror that these were souls who had chosen to separate themselves from God and who were now experiencing the eternal consequences of that choice. The revelation that hit Michael like a physical blow was not just that hell was real, not just that souls could be eternally damned, but that he himself was in danger of sharing this fate, that his comfortable, secular lifestyle and his proud rejection of religious faith had been leading him steadily toward this very destination, and that only by the grace of God had he been given this terrifying glimpse of what awaited him if he continued on his current path. Michael tried to move, tried to run, tried to escape from this place of torment, but he found that his legs would not obey his commands, that he was trapped in this nightmare realm with no way out, forced to confront the reality of his own spiritual condition and the eternal consequences of his choices. The experience seemed to last for hours, though Michael later learned that his clinical death had lasted only a few minutes, and during that time he was forced to confront truths about the nature of good and evil, about the reality of God and the devil, about the immortality of the human soul and the eternal consequences of moral choices that his secular worldview had taught him to dismiss as primitive superstitions. When the paramedics finally succeeded in reviving him, Michael's eyes snapped open and he began screaming, not from physical pain but from the overwhelming terror of what he had just experienced. And his first words were a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to help him understand what had happened to him and how he could avoid returning to that place of unimaginable suffering. What Michael saw during those terrifying minutes in hell was so vivid, so detailed, and so horrifying that even months later, he would wake up in cold sweats, his heart pounding, his mind unable to shake the images that had been burned into his consciousness with supernatural clarity, images that contradicted everything his rational, scientific worldview had taught him about death, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. The landscape of hell, as Michael described it, was not the cartoon-like depiction of red devils with pitchforks that popular culture had made familiar, but rather a place of such profound desolation and spiritual darkness that it seemed to exist in a dimension where hope itself had been systematically extracted from the very fabric of existence, leaving behind only an endless expanse of suffering, regret, and irreversible separation from all that is good, beautiful, and loving in the universe. Michael found himself standing on what appeared to be a rocky, barren plain that stretched to the horizon in every direction. But the rocks beneath his feet were not ordinary stones. They seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were composed of crystallized anguish and despair, and when he looked down at them, he could see faces trapped within the stone, faces of people who appeared to be screaming in agony, but whose voices made no sound, creating an atmosphere of silent torment that was somehow more terrifying than any amount of audible suffering could have been. The sky above him was not black, but rather a deep, oppressive red, like the color of dried blood, and it pressed down on him with an almost physical weight, making him feel as though he were being slowly crushed by the very atmosphere of this place. And there was no sun, no moon, no stars, no source of light, except for the occasional flash of what appeared to be lightning, but lightning that illuminated nothing except more darkness, more desolation, more evidence of the complete absence of divine presence in this realm of eternal punishment. As Michael's eyes adjusted to this hellish environment, he began to notice that the landscape was not empty, but was populated by countless souls, human beings who had once walked the earth just as he had, but who were now trapped in various states of torment that seemed to be specifically tailored to their individual sins and spiritual conditions. And what struck him most powerfully was not just the intensity of their suffering, but the complete hopelessness that emanated from each of them, the absolute certainty that their condition would never improve, never change, never end throughout all eternity. Some of these souls appeared to be wandering aimlessly across the barren landscape, their bodies bearing the marks of whatever sins had led them to this place, moving with the mechanical, purposeless motion of beings who had lost all capacity for joy, love, hope, or any positive emotion. And as they walked, they seemed to be constantly reliving their worst moments, their greatest failures, their most shameful actions, trapped in an endless loop of regret and self-recrimination that offered no possibility of redemption or forgiveness. Other souls seemed to be engaged in futile, repetitive tasks that served no purpose except to emphasize the meaninglessness of their existence, like pushing massive boulders up steep hills only to watch them roll back down again, or trying to fill bottomless containers with water that immediately leaked out. Tasks that seemed designed to drive home the point that all their efforts in this place were doomed to failure, and that they would never again experience the satisfaction of accomplishment or progress. Michael noticed that many of these souls avoided eye contact with him and with each other, as if the shame of their condition was so overwhelming that they could not bear to be seen by others. And when he tried to approach some of them to ask questions or seek understanding, they would turn away or flee, as if even the possibility of human connection had been stripped away from them in this place of ultimate isolation and loneliness. The sounds of hell were perhaps even more disturbing than the sights, because while Michael could see the suffering of these souls, he could also hear it, a constant background noise of weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a symphony of despair that filled the air with such intensity that it seemed to penetrate his very soul and make him feel as though he were drowning in an ocean of human misery and regret. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Michael's vision was his growing realization that this was not temporary, that the souls he was observing were not serving a sentence that would eventually end, but were experiencing the eternal consequences of choices they had made during their earthly lives, choices that had led them to reject God's offer of salvation and to choose instead a path of selfishness, pride, and rebellion against the divine order that governed the universe. If you're finding this testimony as profound and eye-opening as thousands of others have, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a like on this video to help us share these incredible stories with more people who need to hear them. Michael described seeing souls who appeared to be intellectuals, people who had prided themselves on their education and rational thinking, just as he had, but who were now trapped in a state of eternal frustration because they could see the truth clearly but could no longer act upon it, could understand the reality of God and the spiritual realm but could no longer choose to serve him, condemned to spend eternity knowing that they had been wrong about everything that mattered most, and that their intellectual pride had led them to reject the very salvation that could have saved them from this fate. He saw souls who had been wealthy and successful in their earthly lives, but who now found themselves in a state of poverty so complete that they could not even possess their own thoughts or memories without them being tainted by the knowledge of their eternal loss. And he saw souls who had been beautiful and admired by others, but who now bore the marks of their spiritual corruption in ways that made their physical appearance reflect the ugliness of their moral choices. Michael witnessed souls who had been leaders, politicians, business people, and celebrities, people who had commanded respect and wielded power during their earthly lives, but who were now reduced to the same level of helplessness and despair as everyone else in this place, stripped of all their former glory and influence, equal only in their shared misery and regret. What made this vision particularly personal and terrifying for Michael was his gradual realization that he was not simply observing this place as a detached visitor, but that he was in real danger of becoming one of these souls himself, that his own pride, his own rejection of God, his own comfortable materialism had been leading him steadily toward this very destination, and that only by some miracle of divine mercy was he being given this opportunity to see what awaited him if he continued on his current path. The demons that Michael encountered in this place were not the theatrical creatures of horror movies, but were beings of such concentrated evil and malice that their very presence seemed to drain the life and hope out of everything around them, and they moved through the landscape with the confidence of beings who knew that they had won a great victory over the souls under their dominion, souls who had chosen to align themselves with evil rather than good, and who were now experiencing the eternal consequences of that alignment. Michael could feel the weight of eternity in this place, the crushing realization that time, as he had known it on earth, had no meaning here, that the suffering he was witnessing was not something that would last for years or decades or even centuries, but would continue forever and ever, without end, without hope, without any possibility of escape or redemption or second chances. The vision concluded with Michael having a profound understanding that hell was not a place where God sends people against their will, but rather a place that people choose for themselves by rejecting God's love and grace throughout their earthly lives, and that every soul in this place had arrived there through their own free will, through their own choices, through their own decision to value their pride, their pleasures, their material success, or their intellectual independence more than their relationship with their Creator. When Michael Thompson's eyes snapped open in that hospital room, the first thing he felt was not relief at being alive, not gratitude for surviving a massive heart attack, but an overwhelming terror that seemed to penetrate every cell of his body, a fear so profound and all-consuming that it made his cardiac arrest seem like a minor inconvenience in comparison, because what he had just experienced in those few minutes of clinical death had shattered every foundation of his carefully constructed worldview and left him face to face with a reality that his rational, scientific mind was completely unprepared to process or accept. The nurses and doctors who surrounded his bed were amazed by his recovery, calling it miraculous, explaining to him how close he had come to death and how fortunate he was to be alive. But Michael could barely focus on their words because his mind was still reeling from the vivid, terrifying images of hell that seemed more real to him than the sterile hospital room where he now found himself. Images that refused to fade or diminish despite his desperate attempts to convince himself that they had been nothing more than hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation to his brain. Michael's first instinct was to try to rationalize what had happened to him, to find some scientific explanation that would allow him to dismiss the experience as a product of his dying brain, some neurological phenomenon that could account for the incredibly detailed and coherent vision he had experienced. But the more he tried to explain it away, the more he realized that no amount of scientific reasoning could diminish the profound impact of what he had witnessed, or the absolute certainty he felt that he had actually been in hell, and seen the eternal fate that awaited him if he didn't change his life completely. The days immediately following his heart attack were filled with what Michael would later describe as the most intense psychological and spiritual crisis of his entire life, a period of overwhelming anxiety, sleeplessness, and existential terror that left him unable to function normally, unable to focus on his work, unable to engage in casual conversation with his wife or friends, because every moment of every day was dominated by the haunting memory of what he had experienced and the terrifying knowledge that he was living on borrowed time. Sarah, his wife, noticed the dramatic change in his behavior immediately, observing that the confident, rational man she had married had been replaced by someone who seemed to be in a constant state of fear and agitation, someone who would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, who would stare off into space for hours at a time, who would flinch at unexpected sounds as if he were constantly expecting some terrible catastrophe to befall him. When Sarah asked him what was wrong, Michael initially tried to downplay the experience, telling her that he was just shaken up by the heart attack and that he would be fine once he recovered physically. But as the days passed and his emotional state continued to deteriorate, he finally broke down and told her everything he had experienced, describing in detail the hellish landscape, the suffering souls, the demons, and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that had characterized his vision of eternal damnation. Sarah's reaction was exactly what Michael had feared it would be, a mixture of concern for his mental health and gentle skepticism about the reality of what he claimed to have experienced. And she suggested that he speak with a therapist or a psychiatrist who could help him process the trauma of his near-death experience and distinguish between reality and the hallucinations that often accompany severe medical crises. Michael agreed to see a therapist, partly because he desperately wanted to find some way to dismiss or minimize what he had experienced, but also because he was beginning to realize that he needed help dealing with the psychological impact of his vision, regardless of whether it had been real or imaginary. Dr. Patricia Wilson, the therapist Sarah had found for him, was a kind, professional woman who specialized in helping patients recover from traumatic medical experiences, and she listened patiently as Michael described his vision of hell, occasionally asking questions designed to help him process his emotions and separate his medical trauma from what she clearly believed to be elaborate hallucinations produced by his oxygen-deprived brain. Dr. Wilson explained to Michael that near-death experiences were well-documented phenomena that often involved vivid hallucinations, and she assured him that many patients who had undergone similar medical emergencies reported seeing everything from bright lights and deceased relatives to terrifying landscapes and frightening creatures, and that these experiences, while psychologically significant, were not evidence of actual visits to supernatural realms. For several weeks, Michael tried to accept Dr. Wilson's explanations, tried to convince himself that his vision had been nothing more than a hallucination, tried to return to his normal life and his comfortable materialistic worldview, but the more time passed, the more he realized that something fundamental had changed inside him, that he could no longer live with the same casual indifference to spiritual matters that had characterized his previous 43 years of existence. The turning point came when Michael realized that his therapy sessions, while helping him cope with the anxiety and fear that had followed his experience, were not addressing the deeper spiritual questions that had been awakened by his vision. Questions about the nature of God, the reality of hell, the purpose of human existence, and the eternal consequences of the choices he made during his earthly life. Michael began to feel increasingly frustrated with Dr. Wilson's attempts to reduce his experience to mere brain chemistry, partly because her explanations failed to account for the profound spiritual transformation that was taking place within him, but also because deep in his heart, he knew with absolute certainty that what he had experienced was real, more real than anything he had ever encountered in his material existence, and that no amount of psychological counseling could change that fundamental truth. It was during this period of frustration and searching that Michael made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him just a few months earlier. He decided to seek out religious guidance, to find someone who could help him understand what had happened to him from a spiritual perspective rather than a purely psychological one. Michael's first instinct was to visit the church where he had attended Sunday school as a child, a small Protestant denomination in his hometown. But when he spoke with the pastor there, he found the man's explanations about salvation and the afterlife to be somewhat superficial and unsatisfying, lacking the depth and theological rigor that Michael's analytical mind required to fully process his experience. The pastor, while well-meaning, seemed uncomfortable discussing the reality of hell in any detail, preferring to focus on God's love and forgiveness rather than the eternal consequences of sin. And Michael left that meeting feeling more confused and frustrated than ever, realizing that he needed to find someone who could provide him with more substantial answers to the profound questions that were consuming his thoughts day and night. Michael then began what he would later describe as his desperate search for truth, a months-long journey that took him to bookstores, libraries, online forums, and religious gatherings of various denominations, as he tried to find someone, anyone, who could help him understand what he had experienced and what it meant for his life going forward. He read books about near-death experiences, but found that most of them focused on positive, heavenly visions rather than the hellish encounter he had experienced, and the few that did mention hell often treated it as a symbolic rather than literal reality, which contradicted everything he had witnessed during his vision. Michael also began attending different churches, visiting Baptist congregations, Methodist services, Presbyterian meetings, and Pentecostal gatherings, but in each case, he found that the theological explanations he received were either too simplistic for his analytical mind or too focused on emotional experience rather than intellectual understanding. If you're as captivated by Michael's journey as thousands of others have been, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up to help us continue sharing these powerful testimonies that are changing lives around the world. The breakthrough came when Michael discovered that many of the church fathers and medieval theologians had written extensively about hell, not as a metaphor or symbol, but as a real place where souls experienced eternal punishment for their sins. And as he delved deeper into these writings, he began to find the kind of theological depth and intellectual rigor that his mind craved. Explanations that took seriously both the reality of human free will and the eternal consequences of moral choices. Michael was particularly drawn to the writings of St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and other Catholic theologians who had grappled seriously with the difficult questions of divine justice, human responsibility, and eternal punishment, and he found that their explanations resonated with his own experience in ways that the more contemporary, psychologically oriented approaches to spirituality simply could not match. As Michael continued his research, he began to realize that the Catholic Church had maintained a consistent teaching about hell throughout its history, treating it not as an outdated superstition, but as a fundamental truth about the nature of reality, and that this teaching was supported by extensive theological reflection, philosophical analysis, and spiritual wisdom that had been developed over nearly 2,000 years of Christian thought and experience. Michael's discovery of Catholic teachings about hell, salvation, and the afterlife came not through a dramatic moment of revelation, but through a gradual process of intellectual investigation that began when he stumbled upon a book by St. Thomas Aquinas in a used bookstore, a book that would prove to be the key that unlocked a treasure trove of theological wisdom that had been developed over centuries by some of the greatest minds in Christian history, minds that had grappled with the same fundamental questions about existence, mortality, and eternal destiny that were now consuming Michael's thoughts day and night. The book, titled Summa Theologica, was intimidating in its scope and depth, written in a style that was far more rigorous and systematic than anything Michael had encountered in his previous exposure to religious literature. But as he began to work through Aquinas's careful analysis of divine justice, human freedom, and the nature of eternal punishment, he found that the great theologian's arguments addressed precisely the questions that had been haunting him since his vision of hell. What struck Michael most powerfully about Aquinas's approach was not just the logical rigor of his reasoning, but the way he treated hell as a real place, with real consequences, not as a metaphor or psychological construct, but as the inevitable result of free human choices to reject God's offer of salvation. And this understanding resonated deeply with Michael's own experience of seeing souls who had clearly chosen their eternal fate through their own decisions and actions during their earthly lives. As Michael delved deeper into Catholic theology, he discovered that the Church's teaching about hell was not based on a desire to frighten people into submission, but on a profound respect for human dignity and free will, the recognition that God had created human beings with the capacity to choose between good and evil, and that this capacity was so fundamental to human nature that God would not override it, even to prevent people from choosing eternal damnation for themselves. Michael found this explanation both terrifying and compelling. Terrifying because it meant that his own choices had eternal consequences, but compelling because it provided a framework for understanding his vision that respected both the reality of what he had experienced and the justice of God in allowing people to reap the consequences of their freely chosen actions. The more Michael studied Catholic teachings, the more he realized that the Church had developed a comprehensive understanding of the spiritual life that went far beyond simple moral rules or emotional experiences, encompassing a detailed analysis of the nature of sin, the process of salvation, the role of grace, the importance of the sacraments, and the ultimate destiny of the human soul. And this systematic approach to spirituality appealed to his analytical mind in ways that the more informal, experiential approaches he had encountered in Protestant churches simply could not match. Michael was particularly drawn to the Catholic understanding of purgatory, which provided a theological framework for understanding how souls could be purified after death if they had died in a state of grace, but were not yet ready for the perfect holiness required for heaven. And this teaching helped him understand that hell was not the only possible destination for imperfect souls, but that God's mercy provided opportunities for purification and growth, even after death, for those who had maintained their fundamental orientation toward God during their earthly lives. As Michael continued his theological investigation, he began to realize that the Catholic Church possessed not only the most sophisticated intellectual framework for understanding the spiritual realities he had encountered, but also the most practical and concrete means for avoiding the fate he had witnessed in his vision. Through the sacraments, particularly the sacrament of confession, which provided a regular opportunity for repentance and forgiveness, and the sacrament of the Eucharist, which offered real spiritual nourishment and union with Christ. The process of Michael's conversion was not a sudden emotional experience, but a gradual intellectual and spiritual journey that took place over several months, during which he continued to study Catholic theology, attended Mass regularly, and engaged in long conversations with Father Martinez, a wise and patient priest who had been recommended to him by a Catholic friend, and who was skilled at helping intellectually oriented individuals understand the rational foundations of Catholic faith. Father Martinez did not pressure Michael to convert quickly, but instead encouraged him to take his time, to ask difficult questions, to examine his motives carefully, and to make sure that any decision he made was based on a genuine conviction about the truth of Catholic teaching rather than simply on fear or emotional trauma from his near-death experience. During their weekly meetings, Father Martinez helped Michael work through his remaining doubts and objections, addressing his concerns about Catholic teachings on papal authority, the role of tradition in addition to Scripture, the veneration of saints, and other distinctively Catholic doctrines that seemed foreign to his Protestant upbringing. And gradually Michael began to see that these teachings were not arbitrary additions to Christianity, but were logical developments of principles that could be found in the earliest Christian communities. One of the most significant moments in Michael's conversion process came when Father Martinez explained the Catholic understanding of the communion of saints, the belief that all the faithful, whether living on earth, being purified in purgatory, or enjoying the beatific vision in heaven, are united in one spiritual community and can pray for and help each other. And this teaching suddenly made sense of something Michael had wondered about during his vision of hell, namely, why the souls he had seen there seemed so isolated and cut off from any possibility of help or communion with others. Michael realized that hell was not simply a place of physical torment, but a state of ultimate loneliness and separation, where souls who had chosen to live selfishly and pridefully during their earthly lives found themselves eternally cut off from the love and fellowship that they had rejected in life, while heaven and purgatory represented states of communion and connection with God and with other souls who had chosen to orient their lives toward love and service rather than selfishness and pride. As Michael's understanding of Catholic teaching deepened, he began to see that his vision of hell was not simply a warning about what to avoid, but was part of a larger revelation about the nature of reality itself, about the cosmic battle between good and evil that was being fought in every human heart, and about the eternal significance of the moral choices that every person makes during their brief time on earth. The Catholic Church's teachings about grace, salvation, and the means of avoiding damnation began to make perfect sense to Michael, not as arbitrary rules imposed by religious authorities, but as practical guidance for navigating the spiritual, the realities that he had encountered firsthand during his near-death experience. Michael's decision to formally convert to Catholicism was made after months of careful study and prayer, and it was not a decision based primarily on fear of hell, though that certainly played a role, but rather on his growing conviction that the Catholic Church possessed the fullness of truth about God, salvation, and the eternal destiny of the human soul, and that this truth was not only intellectually satisfying, but also practically necessary for anyone who wanted to avoid the fate he had witnessed in his terrifying vision. If you're finding Michael's journey as fascinating and life-changing as so many others have, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button to help us continue sharing these incredible testimonies that are transforming lives around the world. The actual process of Michael's conversion involved several months of formal instruction in Catholic doctrine, a period known as the Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults, during which he studied the Catechism of the Catholic Church, participated in special liturgies, and was assigned a sponsor who helped guide him through the process of preparing for full membership in the Catholic Church. Michael approached this period of instruction with the same methodical thoroughness that he had brought to his engineering career, taking detailed notes, asking penetrating questions, and carefully examining every aspect of Catholic teaching. to make sure that it was consistent with both his intellectual understanding and his spiritual experience. The climax of Michael's conversion process came during the Easter Vigil, when he was formally received into the Catholic Church through the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and First Communion, and Michael later described this experience as the most profound and meaningful moment of his entire life, a moment when he felt that he was finally coming home to the truth he had been searching for, and when he experienced a peace and joy that seemed to heal the spiritual wounds that had been inflicted by his vision of hell. Michael's conversion was not the end of his spiritual journey, but the beginning of a new life oriented around the regular practice of the Catholic faith, including daily prayer, weekly Mass attendance, regular confession, and a commitment to living according to the moral teachings of the Church. Practices that he found provided him with the spiritual strength and guidance he needed to live with confidence and hope, despite his ongoing awareness of the eternal consequences of his choices. Michael's life after his conversion to Catholicism was transformed in ways that went far beyond what he had anticipated when he first began his spiritual journey, because becoming Catholic had not simply given him a new set of beliefs or a different way of spending his Sunday mornings, but had fundamentally altered his entire approach to existence, his priorities, his relationships, his career goals, and his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful and purposeful life in preparation for eternal destiny. The daily routine that had once revolved around professional achievement, material accumulation, and personal comfort was replaced by a rhythm of life that was centered on prayer, service to others, and the cultivation of virtue. And Michael found that this new way of living brought him a sense of peace and fulfillment that he had never experienced during his years as a secular materialist, even though it required him to make significant sacrifices and changes that were sometimes difficult and uncomfortable. Michael's relationship with his wife Sarah underwent a period of tension and adjustment as she struggled to understand and accept the dramatic changes in her husband's personality and priorities, because the man she had married had been confident, ambitious, and focused on building a successful career and comfortable lifestyle, while the man he had become was humble, spiritually and more concerned with eternal matters than with temporal achievements. And initially, Sarah worried that Michael's religious conversion was simply a psychological reaction to his traumatic near-death experience, rather than a genuine spiritual transformation. However, as months passed and Sarah observed the positive changes in Michael's character, his increased patience and kindness, his greater concern for others, his deeper sense of purpose and meaning, and his obvious inner peace despite the challenges he faced, she began to recognize that his conversion had made him a better husband, a better person, and a more complete human being. And eventually, she too began to explore Catholic teachings and ultimately decided to convert herself, not because of fear or pressure from Michael, but because she was drawn to the same truth and beauty that had captured her husband's heart and mind. Michael's professional life also underwent significant changes as he began to evaluate his career choices through the lens of Catholic moral teaching, asking himself whether his work was contributing to the common good, whether it was helping to build up the kingdom of God, and whether it was consistent with his new understanding of what it meant to live a truly meaningful life. And while he continued to work as a software engineer, he began to seek out projects that had social value, and to use his technical skills in ways that served others, rather than simply maximizing his personal income and professional advancement. One of the most significant changes in Michael's post-conversion life was his commitment to sharing his testimony with others, not because he enjoyed public speaking or wanted attention, but because he felt a profound moral obligation to warn people about the reality of hell and to share the hope and peace he had found in the Catholic faith. And he began accepting invitations to speak at churches, conferences, and religious gatherings, always emphasizing that his purpose was not to frighten people but to help them understand the eternal significance of their choices and the incredible mercy and love that God offers to all who seek Him with sincere hearts. Michael's speaking engagements and written testimonies began to have a profound impact on audiences around the world, not because he was a particularly gifted orator or writer, but because his story carried the authenticity and power of lived experience, and people could sense that he was sharing something real and transformative, rather than simply repeating religious platitudes or theoretical concepts. And many individuals who heard his testimony were moved to examine their own spiritual lives and to seek a deeper relationship with God. The message that Michael consistently shared in his presentations was not primarily about the horrors of hell, though he did not shy away from describing what he had witnessed, but about the incredible love and mercy of God, who had given him a second chance, and who offers the same opportunity for redemption to every human being, regardless of their past sins or mistakes. And he emphasized that his vision of hell was not meant to drive people to despair, but to motivate them to seek the salvation that is freely available through Jesus Christ and his church. Michael often reflected on the profound irony of his spiritual journey, noting that the very intellectual pride and rational skepticism that had initially led him away from religious faith had ultimately become the tools that helped him embrace Catholic teaching with greater depth and conviction than might have been possible if he had simply accepted religious truths without careful examination and analysis. And he frequently encouraged other intellectually oriented individuals to approach Catholic theology with the same rigor and thoroughness that they would bring to any other important area of study. One of the most important aspects of Michael's message was his emphasis on the reality of free will and personal responsibility, because his vision of hell had shown him that the souls suffering there were not victims of divine injustice, but were experiencing the eternal consequences of their own freely chosen actions. And he stressed that every person has the power to choose their eternal destiny through the decisions they make during their earthly life, and that no one is predetermined to go to hell, but that damnation is always the result of persistent rejection of God's offer of salvation and grace. Michael also emphasized the importance of not delaying spiritual conversion or taking salvation for granted, because his own experience had shown him how quickly and unexpectedly death can arrive, and he urged his audiences to take seriously the eternal consequences of their choices and to seek God while there was still time, not out of fear alone but out of love for the God who had created them, and who desired their eternal happiness more than they desired it themselves. The transformation in Michael's life served as a powerful example of the reality of God's grace and the possibility of radical conversion, because people who had known him before his near-death experience could see the dramatic change in his character, his priorities, and his overall approach to life. And many of them were moved to examine their own spiritual lives and to consider whether they too might benefit from a deeper relationship with God and a more serious commitment to living according to divine truth. Michael's story also highlighted the importance of the Catholic Church's teaching about the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, because his experience had shown him that these were not abstract theological concepts, but real and immediate realities that every person would eventually face. And he emphasized that the Church's teachings about these matters were not designed to frighten people, but to provide them with the practical guidance they needed to prepare for their eternal destiny. If you're being moved by Michael's incredible testimony and want to hear more life-changing stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up to help us reach more people who need to hear these powerful messages of hope and transformation. The broader message of Michael's experience was that God's love and mercy are available to everyone, regardless of their background, their past mistakes, or their current spiritual condition, but that this mercy must be actively sought and received, and that the decision to accept or reject God's offer of salvation is the most important choice any person will ever make, not only because it determines their eternal destiny, but because it affects every aspect of their life here on earth: their relationships, their sense of purpose, their ability to find true peace and happiness, and their capacity to live with hope and meaning even in the face of suffering and difficulty. Michael's reflection on his journey from skeptical materialism to devout Catholicism revealed that the search for truth is ultimately a search for God, because all genuine truth points toward the divine reality that is the source and foundation of all existence, and he encouraged others to approach this search with intellectual honesty, spiritual openness, and moral courage, even when the truth they discover challenges their preconceptions or requires them to make difficult changes in their lives. The ultimate message of Michael's testimony was that life is far more than what we can see, touch, or measure with scientific instruments, that there is a spiritual dimension to reality that is more real and more important than the material world, and that every person has been created for a purpose that transcends their earthly existence and extends into eternity, and that recognizing and embracing this truth is the key to finding genuine fulfillment, lasting peace, and ultimate meaning in life. Michael's story demonstrated that even the most rational skeptical, and secular individuals can be transformed by an encounter with spiritual reality, and that when this transformation occurs, it brings not a loss of intellectual rigor, but a deeper and more complete understanding of the nature of existence, because faith and reason are not enemies but partners in the search for truth. And the Catholic Church offers a framework for understanding reality that satisfies both the demands of rigorous thinking and the deepest longings of the human heart. As we reach the end of Michael Thompson's extraordinary journey from skeptical materialism to devout Catholicism, from near-death experience to spiritual transformation, from witnessing the horrors of hell to finding peace and salvation in the Catholic Church, it's important to recognize that this story is not just about one man's dramatic conversion, but is a powerful reminder that every single person watching this video right now is on their own spiritual journey, whether they realize it or not, and that the choices they make today, the priorities they set, the values they embrace, and the way they respond to God's call in their lives will have consequences that extend far beyond their earthly existence and into eternity itself. Michael's testimony serves as a wake-up call for all of us to examine our own spiritual lives honestly and courageously, to ask ourselves the difficult questions about what we truly believe, about how we are living our lives, about whether we are taking seriously the reality of our eternal destiny, and about whether we are making the choices that will lead us toward salvation rather than toward the fate that Michael witnessed in his terrifying vision of hell. The first and most important call to action that emerges from Michael's story is the urgent need for each of us to acknowledge that we are not merely material beings who will simply cease to exist when our physical bodies die, but that we are immortal souls who will continue to exist for all eternity, and that this eternal existence will be characterized either by unimaginable joy and peace in the presence of God, or by indescribable suffering and separation from all that is good and beautiful in the universe. And that this eternal destiny is determined not by fate or chance, but by the free choices we make during our brief time on earth. For those who are not currently practicing any religion, or who have been living according to secular materialistic principles, Michael's story is a powerful reminder that it is never too late to turn to God, to seek forgiveness for past mistakes, to begin living according to divine truth, and to find the peace and purpose that can only come from a genuine relationship with our Creator. And that God's mercy and love are always available to those who seek them with sincere hearts, regardless of how far they may have strayed from the path of righteousness. For those who are already Christian but may have become complacent in their faith or casual in their spiritual practices, Michael's testimony is a call to take their relationship with God more seriously, to recognize that salvation is not something that can be taken for granted but must be actively pursued through prayer, sacraments, moral living, and service to others, and that the comfortable, nominal Christianity that characterizes so many modern believers may not be sufficient to ensure their eternal salvation. For those who are Protestant Christians, Michael's story raises important questions about the fullness of truth and the means of salvation, and it serves as an invitation to examine seriously the claims of the Catholic Church, to study the theological and historical foundations of Catholicism, and to consider whether the Catholic faith might offer a more complete and reliable path to salvation than the denominational traditions in which they were raised. Michael's journey demonstrates that intellectual honesty and rigorous examination of religious claims are not obstacles to faith, but can actually lead to a deeper and more confident embrace of divine truth, and that the Catholic Church's teachings about salvation, the sacraments, hell, purgatory, and the communion of saints are not arbitrary doctrines, but are based on nearly 2,000 years of careful theological reflection, biblical study, and spiritual wisdom that has been tested and refined through centuries of Christian experience. The call to action for viewers of this video is not simply to feel momentarily moved or inspired by Michael's story, but to take concrete steps to examine their own spiritual lives and to make the changes that may be necessary to ensure their eternal salvation. And this might involve beginning to pray regularly, attending religious services, seeking out spiritual guidance from qualified clergy, studying religious texts and teachings, making a good confession, receiving the sacraments, or simply having an honest conversation with God about their spiritual condition and their desire to live according to His will. For those who are already Catholic, Michael's story is a reminder of the incredible privilege and responsibility that comes with being part of the Church that Christ established. and it calls them to take their faith more seriously, to participate more fully in the sacramental life of the Church, to study and understand their faith more deeply, to live more consistently according to Catholic moral teaching, and to share their faith with others who may be searching for the truth that they have been blessed to receive. Michael's experience also serves as a powerful reminder that evangelization is not optional for Catholics, but is a fundamental responsibility that flows from their love for God and their concern for the eternal welfare of their neighbors, and that sharing the Catholic faith with others is not a matter of imposing their beliefs on unwilling recipients, but of offering the precious gift of salvation to those who may be desperately searching for meaning, purpose, and hope in their lives. The urgency of this call to action cannot be overstated, because Michael's story reminds us that death can come suddenly and unexpectedly, that we do not know how much time we have left to make the spiritual changes that may be necessary in our lives, and that the eternal consequences of our choices are so significant that no other consideration in life can compare with the importance of ensuring our salvation and helping others to find the same peace and security that comes from a genuine relationship with God. If Michael's incredible testimony has moved you to examine your own spiritual life and consider making changes that could affect your eternal destiny, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up to help us reach more people who need to hear these life-changing messages, and more importantly, take concrete steps today to begin or deepen your own spiritual journey, whether that means starting to pray, attending church services, seeking out spiritual guidance, or simply having an honest conversation with God about your desire to know and serve Him more fully. The conclusion of Michael Thompson's story is not really a conclusion at all, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in his spiritual journey. A chapter that will continue until the day he dies and beyond, as he continues to grow in holiness, to serve God and his neighbors, and to share his testimony with others who may be searching for the truth that transformed his life so completely. Michael's experience reminds us that conversion is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of transformation that requires constant attention, regular spiritual practices, and a willingness to cooperate with God's grace as it works in our lives to make us more like the saints who have gone before us and who now enjoy the beatific vision in heaven. The ultimate message of Michael's story is that no matter who you are, no matter what you have done in the past, no matter how far you may have strayed from God, no matter how hopeless your situation may seem, it is never too late to turn to God, to seek His forgiveness and mercy, to begin living according to His will, and to find the peace, purpose, and hope that can only come from a genuine relationship with our Creator, who loves us more than we can possibly imagine, and who desires our eternal happiness more than we desire it ourselves. Michael's journey from the depths of hell to the heights of Catholic faith demonstrates that God's grace is more powerful than any sin, that His mercy is more abundant than any failure, and that His love is more persistent than any resistance we might offer, and that when we finally surrender to His will and embrace the truth He offers us, we discover that what we thought was a restriction or limitation is actually the key to true freedom, genuine fulfillment, and eternal joy. As we conclude this remarkable testimony, let us remember that Michael's story is not unique in its potential for transformation, but that every one of us has the same opportunity to encounter God's grace, to experience spiritual conversion, to find peace and purpose in our lives, and to prepare ourselves for an eternity of happiness in the presence of the God who created us, loves us, and calls us to Himself. And let us pray that we will have the courage and wisdom to respond to that call before it is too late.